Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 27 of our podcast. We are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey!
Oh, man. All right, folks, so here are the topics we have today. On Present Futures, we'll be discussing evil AI, the future of news media, and Yuval. On Paleo Futures, we'll be discussing Futurist Jim Dator. And on FizBiz, we'll be discussing blockchain investments and companies you need to pay attention to. As always, we hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page, or simply connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. And let's see what the future has in store for us in some future.
That's some future.
All right, Chris. So for my present futures, I wanted to bring up something that has been in the news a lot recently, and that's fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news. You're
around.
fake news. You're fake news.
Everyone's fake news. It's fake news media, CNN, fake news. But here's the thing: is I want to talk about not just any type of fake news. I'm talking about the very real, very scary news generated, not by some Russian hacker who's paying Facebook $15 per ad, but artificially created news articles, pictures, and videos that are being released at an alarming rate, in which something Congress has identified as an extremely alarming trend that will only continue to grow and threaten our very democracy. Dun, dun, dun. Like, that's intense stuff. Yeah. So I wanted to give you an example of what I mean by this by quoting from an article that was recently published in Popular Mechanics. So in 2018, a California-based company called FireEye tipped Facebook and Google off to a network of fake social media accounts from Iran that were conducting campaigns to influence people in the United States. In response, Google and Facebook, using back-end data to determine that a branch of the Iranian government was responsible, removed dozens of YouTube channels, a score of Google Plus accounts, and a handful of blogs. Lee Foster, who's the manager of the information operations at FireEye, was at the forefront of the firm's investigation. Right now, something's automated just by the sheer volume of content pushing out, he said. It's not possible for a human to do this, so it's clearly not organically created. Often you'll see automated retreating of some list of accounts that just to boost out a message. So that's pretty scary stuff, and it's only getting more intense. That's been the reality of what we've been facing for at least the past few decades, with automated disinformation campaigns that are going on that unfortunately many countries are launching against the United States. However, a recent Brookings Institute report outlined some of the changes that are in store. In the very near term, I'm quoting from them, in the very near term, the evolution of AI and machine learning, combined with the increasing availability of big data, will begin to transform human communication and interaction in the digital space. The report, which is called The Future of Political Warfare, predicts that the days of AI catfishing are fast approaching. So there's a sophisticated AI that could detect information about people, determine who is susceptible to a particular message, and tailor the interaction as if that AI was a person. Brookings says AI will micro-target citizens with deeply personalized messaging. They will be able to exploit human emotions to elicit specific responses. They'll be able to do this faster and more effectively than any human ever could. And so, like I said before, this has several members of Congress, the ones who know more about technology than just Microsoft Word and their flip phones. That has them freaking out. It's a few weeks ago, actually, that 3 members of Congress, and this was this month, actually, they wrote Congress a letter. I'm sorry, they wrote a letter. There are 3 members of Congress. They wrote a letter to the Director of National Intelligence asking how concern with fake news, videos, etc., generated by AI. So they're really concerned. And they were saying, what about all of these things? Should they be concerned about them? And these 3 senators in a bipartisan letter stated, and I quote, "We are deeply concerned that that deep fake technology could soon be deployed by malicious foreign actors. And it's from U.S. Representative Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, Stephanie Murphy, Democrat of Florida, and Carlos Curbelo, a Republican from Florida. So the big worry is that foreign governments will one day fool millions of Americans with AI-generated fake video or audio. I mean, just imagine this. So say there's a U.S. politician being depicted as making a racist comment, and the clip goes viral right before an election. Thanks to today's machine learning algorithms, a bad actor might be able to pull this off. I mean, the technology can already clone your voice, swap someone's face with another, and take existing footage and manipulate the subject lips to say something else. In fact, I'll be posting a very realistic video of this, of someone manipulating Barack Obama to say things that he would never normally say. He's a comedian who it's funny, but it's also scary too. So the lawmakers sent that letter to the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, who's, for a long time, actually, he's warned Congress about Russian attempts to use social media to spread misinformation ahead of the midterm elections. So far, the misinformation efforts have generally been confined to inflammatory internet memes and opinions from fake accounts. And, most of the time you can tell that they've been fake. But the lawmakers are calling on U.S. intelligence to examine whether any foreign governments have already attempted to use deepfake technology to spread misinformation in the U.S. They're also asking U.S. intelligence to come up with recommendations on how to counter deepfake-produced content, and whether Congress needs to act in some way. The lawmakers have called on the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to deliver the report by December 14th. So be on the lookout for that. So I have a question for you, Chris. And I know this is something that you and I talk about personally a lot. So, what else have you heard about the technologies behind this, the progression of what's going on?
Well, we did bring this up. It was about 10 podcasts ago or something. I think I was talking about the Radio Lab that I heard. It was maybe last April, and it was talking about Adobe in 2016, and they had developed the software that enabled users to edit the audio using text, which meant that I could essentially record your voice, and if I record your voice for anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, it would pick up all the intonations in your voice, and then I could essentially type text, and I could hear you say defamatory things, positive things about me, whatever. So that means that there's a chance that we can go ahead and change your audio, which is really important, especially when you're talking about currently the day where a piece of audio can bring down a president, a piece of audio can bring down a senator, a piece of audio can bring down I remember the LA Clippers guy. He was caught for, being a racist or whatever. And so, that's audio. And then, of course, just recently, the ability to fake video, as you were saying in the President Obama clip. But, this stuff is getting more and more real looking. It's still a little wonky. You could still kind of see it's not completely there. But keep in mind, this is the beginning of this technology. And, we are a more connected society, meaning we're more connected actually not through our connections face-to-face. That allows us to do this podcast. The fact that we can use Skype and we can connect, look at each other in the eye, and actually have a conversation. It's amazing that we can do this. Wow, what a world that we're connected. But that also means that because you and I are being beamed through ones and zeros through some satellite system, that means that the ability to hack that, the ability to change audio tones, to be able to change video messages, to be able to really create wholesale human interactions, that is extremely dangerous, especially when you have things like, growing nationalism, the impact of voting, the impact of, different types of directions that a people or organization can go to. When you think about things like propaganda, right? You look at, North Korea. There's literally a big speaker that is in the room of citizens of that country that are consistently beaming positive things about their dear leader, right? And these stories and these fables. And in turn, it has created the biggest psychological experiment in human history in the fact that you have millions of people guided by a story or a fake news idea. So we laugh that is something, that could never happen to America, or that could never happen to Western democracy, or never happen to XYZ country you want to say. No, believe it or not, propaganda still does work, and it works at the newspaper level. Right now, I think I would say it's probably working at the television level. What happens when all the mediums that you think you can run away and be safe to, the New York Times, the video that you see that your friend sent over of a police shooting, or of a insane thing that President Trump said yesterday, that could be completely fake and mimicked, and you would have no idea if it would be. This is catastrophic to humanity, to America, to Europe, to Africa, to South America. I mean, it's this is potentially nefarious technology that could really break society. And I don't mean to be flippant about it. There's a real chance that this could have real negative effects, and I think it's something that should be concerning to everybody.
Yeah, man. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. You actually scared me for a second when you said that. I mean, you could hack the internet. Like, you could hack this conversation right now. And if someone had enough of images of you and things like that, they could supplant the video and have you say something like really nasty to me or something like that, and I would have no I wouldn't even know.
Yep.
Because it would be so good that, I mean, even our image quality isn't the best over what we use to interact over these podcasts. So it'd actually be very easy for them to supplant the image and put something else in, or just cut out the video and just do an audio. And I thought that your video has gone out or something. So, I mean, these are the real things that we're not conspiracy theorists, people. Like, these are things that are actually happening and that are going to be concerns over the next couple of years. So then, obviously the question is, how do we fight back against, out-of-state actors or even malicious companies wishing for our country or people to be divided and our people, kept from the truth? So I think, AI, AI to fight AI. You always thought wars would be fought with, these giant artificially intelligent robots fighting for countries with missiles and bombs. However, the first warfare between AI will be in these areas. Corporately, sites like TripAdvisor, Yelp, and Amazon display user reviews of products and services. Consumers really pay attention to those things. 9 out of 10 people read these peer reviews and trust what they see. So not only can it be countries, but corporate espionage. In fact, up to 40% of users decide to make a purchase based on only a couple of reviews. And, these, great reviews, people spend usually 30% more on the purchases. So obviously this, it's not just state to state, but it's a corporation to corporation, company to company. So luckily, if anything came out of good came out of the 2016 election and the fallout of the fake news, scandal, we're starting to take these threats very seriously. Not only is the government realizing this, as the Pentagon recently stated this month that they will be investing billions of dollars into AI research over the next 5 years, but also large corporate players like Google, IBM, Facebook, Microsoft are working on methods to track false information and eliminate it from the internet. Still, there's a long way to go, and it's extremely difficult to remove something from the internet, as everyone knows. Just ask a celebrity with tweets. It only takes one person seeing it, capturing it, and sharing it for it to go viral. So that's a concern, is how do you catch it quick enough for it to even matter? All of this is to say that, unfortunately, in the future, we won't be able to trust articles, comments, etc. from people that you don't know. Fake news is already everywhere. Even though Donald Trump, says that our mainstream media is fake news, but I mean, we have to stay vigilant. That's the most important aspect of this segment in our conversation, is that we have to remember the aspects of what makes this country great. You have to talk to other people. You have to talk about race. You have to talk about your feelings. If you're angry, talk to real life people, because out-of-state actors are very soon going to try to get you to feel angry about things that you're passionate about. And it may be some guy on the internet saying something racist, or it may be coming from an AI, to get your goat, or a Russian actor pretending to be a feminist or extreme leftist. And it may even be something that goes viral right before an election, where it shows a politician saying something that is very out of character for them. We have to learn to be patient and respectful of each other and each other's beliefs. That's the number one thing that I think we can learn from fake news, is that the most important thing we can take out of this segment is that we have to be willing to question what we assume is the truth, even things we see or hear with our own eyes and ears. And unfortunately, that isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, so for present futures for me, I was just in my yard. I was cutting my grass, and I was listening to this podcast with Sam Harris and Yuval Noah Harari, one of my favorite thinkers currently. Actually, both of them I really enjoy. I really enjoy Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. But I've really enjoyed Yuval Noah Harari. And if no one knows about him, he's an Israeli historian. He's a tenured professor in the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's an author of the international bestseller, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Amazing book. It's one of my favorite ones. It came out in 2014. And he goes through all of human history, breaks down money, economics, religion, the end of the Ice Age, science. I mean, in 400 pages and unique, refreshing voice. You get to take a kind of a glimpse of how he views history and puts it all in your hand. It's quite amazing. He then followed that up with Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, sort of a futurist take on the problems of tomorrow. And then just this year, he wrote 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And so his writing really is about an examination of free will, an examination of consciousness, an examination of intelligence. And so when he came on to the Waking Up podcast with Sam Harris, who himself is I guess an intellectual thinker, it was very much a meeting of the minds. And let me tell you, I was totally floored by this conversation. I really hope you guys really take it in. And I've listened to it twice. I think I'm going to probably listen to it again, because they talked a lot about a lot of big stuff. And a lot of it actually had to do with the future of humanity. And of course, we're futurist here, SomeFuture. So I figured I'd bring it up, right? I figured I'd bring it up. And so the minute I started listening to it, I sent it right over to Jack. So I think the one important thing to start out with here is that Yuval, he frames humanity in an interesting way. So he talks about something called the primacy of story, where humanity really creates ideas, and then we all kind of agree on those ideas, and we agree to use those ideas to further humanity. So everything when you really think about it, is these ideas, it's these stories. When we talk about money and gold and exchange systems, we have created a global international monetary system that's made up on nothing, where we value ones and zeros on the screen, or a yellow malleable piece of gold that is valuable, when in reality it's actually extremely malleable. As I just said, you can't use it for flints or arrowheads. You can't eat it. So why would we do it? And he talks about how chimpanzees, they're never going to come and talk about society, right? They're just going to war with each other. So human beings have created stories around themselves, and I think that's an interesting way to sort of frame things, because as they got deeper in the conversation, they started talking about like really big things. So I think when you think of Yuval's way of looking at the world, he looks at the concepts that we talk about in future studies, the concepts of government, the concepts of technology, the concepts of industry, and how they are just concepts, stories that we have created in order to propel society for positive, traction, or sometimes actually regress it. And sometimes those same things that were viewed positively in the past could possibly be viewed negatively in the future. So, then, they had a really great talk on really the nostalgic fantasies of 18th century current models. And I thought this was particularly interesting, because he started to talk about how liberal democracy, and we talk about this, is in trouble.
Yeah.
Liberal democracy, the rise of authoritarian, whether it is, the possibility of nationalism in America, and of course the rise of Trump, the rise of other leaders like Erdogan or Duarte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey. There seems to be an authoritarian, nationalistic fervor. It seems to be building up. It's a call for the old and the past. And what Yuval is saying is like, what is going to happen when we actually have technologies that are going to change what we thought about? And why are we hearkening back to the founding fathers when we talk about the future of humanity, when we should actually be talking about things that are impacting us very soon, such as biotechnology changing people into superhumans? Are we going to have superhuman rights? Are those going to be new right systems that we're going to impact here? How important is liberal democracy? And one thing that he talked about was, that for past 100 years, the customer is always right, and you do what you want. The individual is the most important thing. That's what liberal democracy was. Honestly, that is really what the Enlightenment was about understanding who we could be as individuals and then creating a society around that. Well, what happens when you can now get hacked into your individual psyche? So now people, through Facebook or through fake news, as we were talking about, can be impacted. It can change themselves to actually pick and choose things, sort of game their mind, which aren't actually necessarily good for them. And in turn, you actually see this. You see the rise of nationalism, progressively more racism, more othering, quote unquote. And this is actually a potentially destructive thing. And oh, by the way, there's technology that can actually create more of this. And that's actually extremely hard to do. In some ways, the inner arena, which has been sort of docile for many years, right? It was hard for the church. It was hard for science. It was hard for kings to get inside the peasant's mind. But now it's super easy, right? You put it, there's a TV on every corner. You've got a Facebook group, and you could surround that person with constant information that serves your purpose. And that's actually quite powerful. So when he talked about how this could be the end of liberal democracy, because the power to compel reason and to compel the hearts has a chance to make democracy irrelevant. And, I think that was another thing that he brought up too, the power of irrelevance. He spoke on, during the 1700s and 1800s and probably, maybe the beginning of the 20th century, right, in the 1900s, when exploitation was super important. This was the big idea of communism, where capitalism did not care about people to the point where we were having to work slave wages for no money, and that we had to unionize in order to go against the bourgeoisie, right? That was the whole idea against communism. And he said that was the problem of the past, exploitation. The problem of the future is actually even worse, irrelevance. So in exploitation, you have a job. Yes, it's a menial job, but at least you're a part of the system. The people need you in order to generate the economy. In the future, irrelevance means you don't have a job. You have no need. You're expendable. We can get rid of you. And that is actually super impactful. So I think that dichotomy of exploitation versus irrelevance is particularly important. He also brought up the concept of UBI, Universal Basic Income. I thought it was interesting. He thought it was a good idea. But his important thoughts around it were, he's got a problem with universal. He's got a problem with basic. Income is fine. But universal and basic, those are good questions to ask. What is universal when it comes to, the future of biotech and who has access to artificial intelligence? What is basic? What is basic human rights? Who equates those? Who makes up these ideas when it comes to these ideas around UBI, right? He agrees that there's a need for income to sustain society, perhaps, but we have to figure out a way to supplant what universal and basic is. And then I think one last point I want to bring up to you is his concept that we have to get around something called global loyalty. So actually, one interesting thing was, he thinks we need to get together globally, but he feels that nationalism is really important. Let me tell you why that's an interesting concept, because what he's saying is he thinks that if we come together as a world, it's important, but that nationalism actually is a way to get to globalism or get to more of a global environment. And what he means by that is that just in the past 100, 200, 300 years, maybe 500 years, we've had nationalism. Nationalism hasn't existed. We haven't had whole countries. And what nationalism has allowed us to do is allowed us to fight wars for hundreds of millions of people around us, to get taxes for hundreds of millions of people around us, so you can make a common goal or common vision for people around you that you will never meet. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of Americans that live in this, this continent with you that you've never seen, but that you are having an impact on your life through, XYZ thing that you're going to do when it comes to the idea of the American ideal, right? How to make it happen. This is happening across organizations, not only in countries, but in organizations like the EU or OPEC. So there's a chance for people to come together for a common goal that actually is bigger than themselves. And one thing that I found really interesting was that he felt that it's easier to go from the carrying of 100 million people to 8 billion people versus from 0 to 100 million. And actually, I do agree with that, right? I think that it's an easier sort of bridge to cross. And he felt that, there always has to be a common enemy to get around, and when it comes to nationalism. So he says the 3 common enemies for global Earth currently are nuclear war, climate change, and technological disruption. And, a couple of those, of course, we talk about a lot, but I do think coming around ideas is particularly important. And, all of those, there's only a global choice in order to tackle them. So this was an extremely deep conversation. They went in a lot of different places. I find Yuval Noah Harari one of the greatest thinkers of our age. The fact that he was with Sam Harris is super interesting to me. And I don't know, what did you think? What did you think of the conversation?
Yeah, man. So I've read some of his stuff over the years, and he's a really interesting guy. I would go on the border of eccentric, but because he doesn't own a smartphone, he lives on a commune, practices meditation, 1 to 2 hours every day.
Yeah.
But some of those people are some of the best thinkers out there because they can almost separate themselves from the environment they live in to be able to think about these types of things. I think that he's really. He gets a lot of things right, in my opinion. In the field of artificial intelligence, like what we were saying is, he's really putting this idea of this case that, we have this new social class, and we'll have this Novah rich, group of people who will be controlling everything. And I think that goes kind of exactly what we were talking about before the podcast with artificial intelligence and the growth of humanity, these 8 billion people or something like that. In a way, I think he's advocating for population control. And that is an interesting concept because a lot of people look at that and that they think that's taking away freedom. The idea of, being able to limit your population so that you can, maintain natural resources into a sustainable level. I think that's one thing he advocates for, because with biotechnology, what's happening is we're living longer. We could potentially live, hundreds of years to not thousands. He talks about all of these different technological innovations that will change what we are as a species, this human evolution, where he says, we became these sentient beings to now become something greater. He says that as we exist now, we'll disappear within 100 years and something new will take its place, which, you can't argue with, because you see people like Elon Musk saying that, we're going to have these new devices that we're going to implant in our bodies. So these are really interesting and fascinating concepts that I really feel like he hits on the head. But in the end, what I think he does and says, which is the best, is he says, look, I'm not saying, we have to focus on all of these things. We need to determine what we exactly need to focus on. So what we need to look at to say, all right, this is what we need to do, and this is what we need to think about. He's a thinker. He says you need to think about these things and talk to people and come up with these realizations on your own. And that is the best way to prepare for the future.
Okay, great. So for my Paleo Futures today, I wanted to bring up someone who is retire-ish. I mean, you never really completely retire until you're gone. But it's Jim Dator. Jim Dator, I've met him once. So he is a legendary person in the futures world. He is a professor, director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii, adjunct professor in program, public administration, College of Agriculture, and the Center of Chinese Studies. It's insane the amount of schooling this guy has and the teaching that he's done. He's taught in Tokyo. He taught at the University of Maryland, Virginia Tech, University of Toronto, the University Consortium for postgraduate studies in Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia. His background is he's got a BA in ancient medieval history and philosophy from Stetson, an MA in political science from Penn, PhD in political science from the American University, and then he did postgraduate work at the Virginia Theological Seminary in ethics and church history, Japanese language at Yale, linguistics and quantitative methods at the University of Michigan, mathematical applications in political science at SMU. It's just insane. And honestly, this is what you want. This is really what you want as a futurist teacher, because futures is, it's very wide. What I remember my own professor, Dr. Peter Bishop, used to tell me, futures is, 1 mile wide and 6 inches deep, right? You want to get a piece of everything, and you want to understand everything because you have to have that sort of lens and that view. So Jim's also, a Danforth Fellow, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, consults widely on law, governance, and tourism, and has, just really found his way into legendary status, if there was like a Mount Rushmore of, current futurists, especially in academia, Jim Dator would be up there along with Sohail in Tula, who we've had on the podcast. I think we need to get him on. We need to hey, Jim, please come on SomeFuture. Give us some oxygen, if you will. I think we need to definitely reach out for sure. So really,
shout out to Jim.
Shout out to Jim Dator.
If you're listening.
If you're listening. So, I wanted to just bring up a couple of his ideas because he's written, so many pieces of research, but I think some of them are, pretty tangible. Some are easy to sort of pick up. The first idea is really his idea on what futures is and what it isn't. And I'm just going to pull his words out, and then we'll talk a little bit about his rules for the future, his laws for the future, Dator's laws of the future. So let me just quote him specifically. So future studies is generally understood from two perspectives. On one hand, there are those who believe it is or pretend it to be a predictive science, which, if properly applied, strives to foretell with reasonable accuracy what the future will be, right? And of course, we talk about it all this time. And he said, and this is right after this, he said, there is no future studies worthy of your attention, that does this, right? Because nothing in society beyond the most trivial can be precisely predicted. And I actually do believe that. And I think we're careful to make sure we don't precisely predict things. And you know what I mean? But on the other hand, it is not the case that it is hopeless to try to anticipate things to come, or that anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's. So he says that's wrong. Even though the future cannot be predicted, and certainly no prediction of the future, no matter how eminent the source, should be uncritically, quote unquote, believed, there are theories and methods that futurists have developed, tested, and applied in recent years, which have been found to be proven useful and exciting. So understanding and applying the theories and methods of future studies will enable individuals and groups to anticipate the futures more usefully and to shape it appreciably more for their own preferences. So I think that's, if anything, that is a call for SomeFuture as a podcast, right? Because it's like, hey, we're out there, we're trying to help the individual, trying to help organizations figure this out. So he supplants this with Dator's laws of the future. So law number 1, the future cannot be predicted because the future does not exist, which completely makes sense, right? There's images of the future, things we can do, but the future doesn't exist because it's the present. It's always the present, right?
Exactly.
So he kind of then says, he goes 1A, right? So he says the future, while it cannot be predicted, alternative futures can be forecasted and can be kind of thought about, right? 1B is the future cannot be predicted, but preferred futures can be envisioned, they can be invented, they can be implemented, evaluated, revised, and then re-advised. So it's sort of a continuous journey, right? And then again, his 1C, to be useful, future studies needs to proceed and they be linked to strategic planning and thence administration. So you could see that you're just constant need to sharpen your saw in order to get better at everything as you push forward. So that's rule number 1. So rule number 2, I find this to be my funniest, or his funniest. any useful idea about the future should appear ridiculous. Which is amazing, right? Because you think like new ideas, right? New technologies permit new behaviors, new values, challenging old beliefs and values, right? This is the black swan concept. Something that nobody thought about was going to completely change society. And that's what futurists really long for, those black swan events that don't happen, right? So it's sort of crazy. So thus, in popularity and even professionally, considering the most likely future is honestly the least likely future, which is, particularly interesting. If futurists expect to be useful, they should really expect to be ridiculed, which is important. And thus, decision makers and general public, they wish useful information about the future should expect it to be unconventional and quite shocking, actually, and offensive and patently ridiculous. So that's an interesting concept. Maybe we should be a little bit more ridiculous on the show. And then, of course, his third idea, which I think is even beyond futures, is we shape our tools, and therefore our tools shape us. So it's very much a Marshall McLuhan when it comes to that. But in the tools that we use in order to help us predict the future, invent the future, create the future, allows us to continually sharpen our saw to understand what we do. So I think Dator's laws of the future are particularly interesting and helpful, and I think hopefully they're helpful to those of our of our audience who are listening. It's really a fun way to actually think about what future studies really is. And then I'll talk real quick about his four futures concept, because I think also that is a particularly interesting framework to use. So essentially his model involves the narratives, right, the stories and scenarios on social change, right? Social change is actually how society changes. If you understand how society changes, you can therefore predict it. So it's really good to understand social change if you want to be a great futurist. So these social change issues, they can be kind of classified into four recurring groups of images, stories, and policies that are going to affect this change, right? So number one is continuous. There's sort of business as usual. We're just kind of doing the same thing. A little status quo growth, but not much change. And then number two is limits and discipline. So it's sort of behaviors that adapt to growing internal environmental limits. I think you see this happening a lot when it comes to democracy. This is happening a lot when technology, when we talk about the rise of automation, this is something where you definitely have limits and discipline. People are trying to figure out what to do with it. His third, recurring group is decline and collapse. And you definitely see this, obviously, not only in the economic world, you see this happening environmentally around the world, systems where there's system degradation, failure, and sort of crisis emerges. And then the fourth recurring image is transformation, new technology, new business, new social factors allow for change. And then he actually does a really good job of encapsulating in a framework that's actually interesting to look at. So Jim, not only would he be a great podcast guest, but I think his work, stands the test. And, I think what's interesting about him is that because he has such a wide array of stuff to kind of choose from in his toolkit, which allowed him to kind of take a look at the future and understand it, holistically. He's been able to kind of take a view of futures as, I think, something that's bigger. Sometimes when I look at futurists, I think they're being too small. They want to have a future. They want to be able to predict the future of a technology space. They want to be the future of XYZ, this specific topic, be the number one futurist, and the future of, bisexual pandas or something, something along, whatever, something very specific. But the reality is that sometimes you need to have a bigger view of futures, and that's super, super important. I don't know. What did you think of, the laws of the future? What did you think of, things like his four futures, or just Jim in general?
Dude, so I watched a lot of what his I guess his YouTube videos and things like he's done with the University of Hawaii, and it's pretty interesting stuff. Like, this guy trains futurists. I mean, that's the kind of thing where there are people like that exist out in the world. I try to do some of that on a smaller scale, and when I teach in business courses. But the fact is that he is, just a really cool dude. I mean, I guess that's the best way to describe him. Is he's the kind of guy who since the 70s, since the early days of what, we would consider like this futures movement, is the one who is saying, this is what we need to teach people so they can go out into the world and be corporate futurists, corporate strategists, go out there and say, you need to predict the future. You need to go out there and say, this is what you need to do in order to succeed as a company in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's something that not enough companies are doing. And that's something that, it's an admirable trait in somebody who is trying to get people to think like that, especially within the realms of technology and everything. But not only just that, in other aspects of business and, maybe government and things like that. That's something that he does that I think he does a really good job of. And I mean, you said like he's retired. I mean, he's not even really retired. I mean, he still is doing all of this stuff. And, that's what I said. You're not, like you said, you're not retired until you're dead. And I mean, I think he's the kind of guy who's just going to be out there and he's going to be talking about this kind of stuff, and way past even probably when we're going to be talking about it, because he's going to outlive us and be half machine or something like that, because they're going to love the work he's done. They're going to, donate his brain to science, and he's going to be a robot. Well, but yeah, that's.
Well, I really enjoy thinkers like Jim, and I think sometimes future studies gets labeled as faddish or silly. It's not a hard science, right? It's more of a squishier type of science because it involves so many different types of sciences, and it's social science, right? It's not a hard science like a physics or even a computer science, right? It involves looking at the qualitative factors, some quantitative. There's a lot of quantitative stuff when it comes to future studies, but a lot of it is qualitative. A lot of it is having soft eyes and being able to kind of pick up the stuff. To quote one of my favorite shows, The Wire, like having the ability to kind of pick out the things that can actually change things, and then being able to make that idea actually bigger, being able to paint a larger canvas with your ideas and your frameworks to encapsulate all of society. I think that's what drew me to future studies. I think what drew you to future studies, having the ability to talk big about this big stuff. And when you have a leader, a thought leader like Jim Dator, who's been continually changing minds, changing the way we view the world, and looking at it through an interesting lens, and then, of course, educating other people that can change minds, that leaves a lasting legacy. So hats off to you, Jim. We're big fans, and, I think we can't wait to get you on the show.
Want some money?
Hey, Chris, you know what time it is?
I don't know. I don't know what time it is.
Well, it's time for every investor's favorite segment of our show.
FizBiz!
It's time again for FizBiz!
FizBiz! Fizzin' and bizzin'.
Right. Yes, fizzin' and bizzin'. So, all right, it's also time for the disclaimer, to say that we aren't responsible for any investment choices you make based off of this segment of our show. These are our opinions, and if you are old enough to download this show and listen to it, then you are old enough to make your own choices.
Yeah, and those choices, don't listen to me, listen to Jack, but because I don't care. I'm going to tell you whatever I want you to, and if it gets in your mind, it's like ideas are the ultimate virus. They really are. Yeah. Ideas can change things. So I'm going to tell you all the wrong companies to invest in, for sure. It's going to happen. I'm just kidding.
All right, man. So we've been doing this show now, I think for a little over a year.
27 episodes.
27 episodes.
27 episodes.
That I think I've remained kind of consistent when it comes to digital currency. When I've always, indubitably remained a digital currency doomsday doubter. It's something that I feel is just too hackable, too unregulated, and too dangerous for the everyday investor. Especially now, and not when the first and most prominent Bitcoin, was a penny years and years ago. Even then, when I had a chance to invest in it, I didn't. And, some people call me stupid for that, but I just didn't see the point. So, however, I've always remained optimistic about the underlying principles in digital currency, i.e. blockchain, albeit with security concerns still in the back of my brain. However, blockchain is becoming more and more a word thrown around in boardrooms, as it's becoming a technology that allows us to do a lot of different things in different industries and do it quicker, more efficiently, and in some regards, safer. So I'm going to talk about a few of these companies that are trying to get a piece of the blockchain pie, per se, and in which some experts predict will become, they're predicting the industry will become, it varies. $13.96 billion is something that I heard recently, and that's in the next few years. The industry players range from, large tech giants to small players, and there are about, I'd say, 12 to 14 like main industries, although it's not necessarily limited to that, but those are the main ones that are being affected by blockchain. And these industries are healthcare, insurance, real estate, supply chain and logistics, IoT, banking, finance, and fintech, identity protection and internet security, energy, retail, legal, music, and food, which, those later ones you may not realize are being affected by blockchain. So I'm going to bring up a couple of different companies that
that's a lot.
I believe.
That's a big list.
Yeah, it's a big list. So I've got a huge long list that I've compiled of different blockchain companies that we can always post this later on, on social media or, on one of our websites or something like that. But, I'll bring up a couple from each of those categories and kind of go into which ones I really feel are safer investments than other ones. Obviously, I don't think that all blockchain is. I think it's a riskier investment. But if you're young and you get in at an early time period and you don't invest that much money into it, it could potentially pay off, is what I'm thinking. So I'm going to go into some of these companies that are just starting. I know obviously there are companies that are dealing with blockchain that are large companies. You've got your IBMs and et cetera. But I think that these are good startups to at least look at and maybe even look at just their products to see if it might interest you. Some healthcare startups that I wanted to bring up. One is called Burst IQ. So it offers a health data platform that combines the security of blockchain, the power of big data, and the processing advantages of AI. It was the winner of the prestigious Red Herring Award in 2018. It's HIPAA and GDPR compliant. It links providers, digital health B2B services, pharma, insurers, government, consumers, and developers through its blockchain platform. That's a pretty cool one. There's one called Shivum, which aims to create the world's largest DNA database. So genomic data is soon, to be big business. You've heard about it in the news recently. Shivum wants to actually help individuals manage their own information. So instead of, 23andMe or whatever managing your information for you, you can manage your own information. And I'm a firm believer that, it's actually good to put your data out there because it helps with research and things like that. I mean, it's not really affecting me if someone uses my genetic data. I don't see how that could harm me per se, but maybe that makes me more optimistic about that. But this is a startup that offers customers the tools to share their DNA data with the emerging genomic marketplace. So whenever and however they choose, instead of 23andMe, which will use it and sell it to other people and other organizations. So this allows you to give it away for free. All right, so there's blockchain insurance. I'm more weary when it comes to like the financial organizations, insurance, banking, etc., because obviously what we've seen with Bitcoins is that blockchain isn't unhackable. I mean, it's supposed to be secure, but it's, anything you put on the internet is free game a lot of the time. So I'm going to mention a couple of these real quick, and then I'll go into some real estate startups that I'm excited about. So there's one called Fidential. It provides a trading marketplace for life insurance policies. Users can actually sell their policies, which is pretty interesting, and you can buy policies from other users. So that's kind of interesting in a way. There's B3I, which it's pretty promising in the fact that it's a blockchain trading platform for insurance and reinsurance industries, and it's got backers such as Munich Re, Swiss Re, Zurich, Allianz, Aegon, and others. So some big names behind that company. All right, so the real estate startups. I'm just going to mention some names. There's SafeChain, which does real estate transactions. So there's a lot of actually corruption in real estate. So it's, while blockchain isn't 100% secure, it's probably more secure than other methods of transactions that are going through the real estate industry every day. So that's a pretty interesting one. There's Propy, which is a real estate marketplace that uses blockchain to facilitate real estate purchases as well. But they say that it can be performed faster with less risks. It says, it also lists properties. It has like 9,000 properties listed. There's BrickBit. There's one called eLocations, which is it's real estate's basically $1 trillion market. It's obviously huge in the United States. So what it does is it takes commissions for agents and listing fees, but it makes it more opaque. And this is why it actually what it does is it makes it more clear. So what it does is it's the world's largest listing portal for commercial real estate. That's what they advertise anyway. It's got backers, huge backers again, like Apple, Gucci, Zara, Allianz, Swiss Life. That's one to look at. You've got supply chain. There's Block Verify, OmniChain are really good ones to take a look at if you're interested in supply chain investing. They're doing some really cool things in supply chain. That's one that I feel like is more safe because it's not going to necessarily be targeted by hackers as much as the banking financial industries. IoT. There's a company called Zage, which provides a decentralized security solution for distributed assets. In other words, they basically help secure IoT infrastructures. Now, this is a really cool one that I like. It's called Open Wi-Fi. What it does is, so they have 75,000 hotspot hosts. So think of it like the Airbnb for your Wi-Fi connection. So you can basically bring, it's a way for them to bring Wi-Fi to the masses, and a way for you to sell unused Wi-Fi. Maybe you're at work and you're not using your Wi-Fi. You can, send it out to the world. And, if you don't have any Wi-Fi limits, it might be a good thing to do. And you can turn it off and on whenever you want. There's blockchain logistics companies called CargoX, ShipChain, Pakeet. Like I said, I'm going to post all of these on there. Tato. So Tato is pretty cool. Tato's goal is to create an efficient and fair way for people to access the computational power they need for AI development. Now, this is pretty cool. So basically what you can do, it's like the Airbnb for your unused processing power and computing power. So basically what you're doing is you're either giving it away or selling it for not that much, to be honest, but your spare computing power. So AI researchers can use that power to do AI research. So that's pretty neat stuff. There's blockchain banking, which me, I'll give you the names. If you want to research them, please do. There's one called Bit, one called Stellar, Bab. Those are three big ones that kept coming up in my research. There's blockchain finance. There's Debitum Network. It's a blockchain-based lending platform that facilitates loans and investments. There's Amasego, which aims to facilitate banking services without the banks. TradeLX makes possible to transfer funds, assets, and credits around the world. It was the winner of the Best Innovator in Global Trade Award at the Trade Finance Excellent Awards in 2017, and it's API-driven. Blockchain fintech, there's a company called Rate3, CU Ledger. It's a cryptocurrency exchange, which, I'm not judging people who want to do their cryptocurrency, and, have at it. Equi Capital, which is what they're trying to do is basically it aims to disrupt the traditional venture investment market by making it easier for the crypto community to invest whatever. Blockchain identity. Now, this is pretty cool, being able to protect your identity. There's a company called Nuggets, which offers security and anonymity and control when making purchases online. So that's pretty cool. It gives the power back to the consumer about what data is being used. Civic uses biometrics to verify the user's identity. That's pretty cool. So you can do online purchases knowing that they're safer. Authentic is basically another ID security blockchain platform, uses facial recognition. Blockchain energy. I told you there's a lot, and I'm sorry. I'll keep going until you tell me to stop.
There's so many. Gee,
there's so many blockchain companies. I mean, that's why I'm trying to go through this list as quickly as possible.
Let's just stop here too, because I think we have to think about. Let's try to frame this a little bit, because as you could see, I think when we talk about things like blockchain, and pardon me for interrupting you, but I think it's good to plant this flag because it's important. Blockchain is a technology similar to the way that artificial intelligence will and Internet of Things and many of the other technologies, the ones and zeros language that powers the world and indeed makes everything happen around the earth. But what's interesting about blockchain is exactly what you're prescribing. It's sort of embedded itself in all sorts of industries because it has the ability to take hold, because it's this ledger system. And well, what is ledger system? A ledger system is a way to input data and to say, okay, I inputted data at this time. It's a stamp, essentially. Boom, this is what happened at this time, whether it's a transaction, whether it is a accounting mechanism, whether it is a picture, a sensor, it's almost a nouveau database system. Think of the Oracle database systems and all the other database systems that we have used to collect data and to be able to share that data with people and with information. I think in some ways, artificial intelligence allows for continuous information flow through algorithmic stuff. And I think blockchain is very much more like an Oracle database system where it's a timestamp allowing for inputs to not only be stamped, but also to be able to be verified. And when you have verification, that really cleans up a lot of what happens in commerce. And keep in mind, too, we've had commerce ever since human beings have existed. I'm selling you conch shells, I'm selling you fish, I'm trying to sell cattle. Of course, that was how banking evolved. And in turn, there have been people who have been trying to always cheat the system, cheat the commerce system. Oh, they're going to, add, they're going to try to sell you chickens at the scale, and they're going to maybe put some rocks underneath the chicken's feet, right? And so they can get a better price, something along those lines, versus what's happening now in the global interconnected economy where you can actually just game a system. You could do something like high-frequency trading or do some sort of informational industrial espionage, or you can do straight fraud, right? Right now you can do Medicare fraud, you can do all sorts of different paperwork fraud, even offshore banking systems that impact our global commerce systems. There's a lot of fraud in just commerce in general. So I think what blockchain does and where its future lies in is the ability to have some sort of verification within this international commerce system. And oh, by the way, commerce affects every single industry. So that would mean that blockchain systems, blockchain management systems will need to be created for each industry. It'll have to, serve the pain points of each one. And in turn, you have these different, startups that are sort of evolving around the ecosystem that is blockchain. Now, of course, not every single one of them is going to be a winner. Blockchain still needs a lot of regulation around it. We've talked about this. We know that it's going to, the banking, the old school ways, people make a lot of money off of scamming the old school ways. And so they're not going to allow blockchain to come over easily and just make sense of the commerce system, because there's a whole heck of a lot of money being made around the world by mucking up commerce, by actually cheating it. And so by creating a system that allows you to clean it up, the powers that be, probably similar to the kind of push and pull that's happening when it comes to hydrocarbons versus renewables, you're going to have a similar push and pull happening when it comes to the blockchain verified world versus the sort of mucky, murky world of international banking and finance. So I think it's interesting to see it develop. And I think that might even be an interesting framework or lens to view it in is, what happens when the powers that be do not want blockchain to overtake certain parts of industries, certain parts of the economy, and then, of course, which companies and or which industry blockchain companies will be the interesting ones to fit that play. So I think that clarity maybe could even take us to, to the end of the segment.
Well, when what you're seeing here, though, is also that they're being supported. These little small companies are being supported by those big guys. These big guys realize these technologies. I mean, you're exactly right. IoT, blockchain, artificial intelligence are all connected. I mean, they're the new technologies that are going to be mentioned for decades to come. And this is just one small aspect. A lot of these already have artificial intelligence incorporated, and you saw IoT. It's an interesting concept that's happening right now. I want to go into like 2 or 3 more industries, and then I'm going to talk more about what we were just talking about, more blockchain and like why you should invest or why you should be looking at these types of things for blockchain. So one thing is, so blockchain retail. So you've got Beam, which uses the power of blockchain technology to pay for payment gateways in the UAE. There's Shopin. There's Navibration Experiences, which is the world's first social network of audio-guided tours built on blockchain technology. There's Petron. It's Patron. That was the Japanese ICO's largest release last year. It raised $40 million. There's smart contracts and legal. There's SMRT, which what they do is a la carte smart contracts for startups and small businesses. So you don't have to hire an attorney necessarily and then pay lots of thousands of dollars. There's Treon, which actually is trying to transform the utilities market. OpenLaw.io enables attorneys to easily execute legal agreements. There's ledgers for legal uses. Blockchain music. So there's one called Tune, which is a music streaming platform. Audios replaces traditional music distribution and music rights management systems. And then finally, blockchain food. You've got Ripe.io, which uses the power of blockchain to unite food producers, distributors, and consumers from IoT-enabled farms to the grocery aisle. And then there's SyncroLife, which combines blockchain technology with social media to help you pick your next restaurant. It's pretty neat stuff. So those are all companies that I've heard of, but I wanted to caution our listeners at the end of this segment. I'm still concerned about blockchain, obviously, and you and I went into it. Basically, anything you put on the internet is at risk of being hacked. I don't care what you say. We've got the government who has, removed their servers from any online access because they're concerned that other actors will get in there. So while blockchain was designed to make hacking difficult, as what can be seen with digital currencies, it's still hackable. You have to remember that blockchain is a form of immutable digital record keeping that stores all transactions taking place across its network. But the major element of blockchain is that the technology enables the creation of transactions that are supported or that are supposed to be highly resistant to fraud. So they do have fraud methods built inside. But as a result, it's supposed to lower the risk and allow for peer-to-peer transactions like what Chris was talking about. It's supposed to enable those independent parties to directly conduct business. But in doing so, blockchain also transforms traditional labor-intensive processes into efficient, cost-effective ones. So the best companies that you're looking at here are going to be the ones that save money for these industries, because those are the ones people are going to be investing in. Either they save money for the consumer or for the business. So in the end, I would suggest do your own in-depth research if you're considering investing in any of these companies. But it still might be worth it for a slightly risky investment to get in on the ground floor of some of these companies so that when a safer and more secure internet is created, and yes, I'm talking quantum internet, which is a huge issue for most of what we've talked about so far in the show, these companies will garner a lot more interest. And if you're there on the ground floor, you might be able to, see your investment rise quite significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, the other thing to think about when it comes to blockchain is what sort of, industry markers you want to pay attention to. As I was saying, blockchain is super important when it comes to sort of marking commerce properly. So think about the places where you want to have, business transaction be done in an effective manner. You could do this in a lot of different ways. Some of the most inventive ways I've seen blockchain be used is actually just in commerce in general, in the exchange of money. So the ability to use blockchain to, pay for beer, right? And you could connect it to a brewery. You can get the exact amount of beer that you want out. Similar to the way, wine bars work, where you get a card, you can kind of pick and choose which wine you want to do. There are ways of getting the exact amount of candy, the exact amount of beer, the exact amount of gasoline through some sort of blockchain network. So I think understanding it through that lens is actually particularly important. But as Jack said, I think we're still at the beginning of the blockchain ecosystem. It's still developing. And I think you want to pay very close attention to the way the regulations are set around it and the way people are attacking specific uses of blockchain in the industry. So, keep your eyes open, pay attention, but blockchain is definitely here to stay.
All right, guys. Hi. For guest speaker today, we have Tom Lombardo, and I'm going to go ahead and give you an intro. Tom, thank you for joining us. So Thomas Lombardo is the director of the Center for Future Consciousness and the Wisdom Page. He's the editor of Wisdom and the Future, and Professor Emeritus and retired faculty chair of psychology, philosophy, and the future at Rio Salado College. He is a fellow and executive board member of the World Future Studies Federation, a member and contributing editor of numerous futurist organizations and publications. He has published 8 books and over 50 articles and given an equal number of professional presentations on many futurist topics, including the future of education, the future of consciousness, and the human mind, dystopian and utopian thought, theories of the future, and science fiction. His newest books include Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution, which was the winner of the Network Book Award 2017, and Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future, hailed as a brilliant piece of work and a must-read in the study both of science fiction and the future. He is a graduate of the University of Connecticut and University of Minnesota and a graduate fellow of Cornell University. Thank you, Tom, so much for being on our show today. We're going to go right into it. First off, we're really excited to have you on our show because I feel like, Chris, we don't talk enough about science fiction. And I'm being, completely false that we talk a lot about science fiction.
It seems like we talk about it all the time.
Yeah, we love science fiction, and so we're really excited to have you on the show, Tom. One, to talk about science fiction, another to talk about your book, which is your journey. So I'm going to jump right into it, Tom. Again, thank you for being on the show. So tell me more about your experience with science fiction, obviously around when you were a young child to its progression through time, and tell us some of the main themes that are constantly repeated and what you've been able to see and what that means for the future.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of people who, as adults, love science fiction, I got into science fiction when I was a little kid. And through H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and both the movies and books of The Time Machine and War of the Worlds and Journey to the Center of the Earth. So as far back as I could remember, when I was like 6, 7 years old, I was into aliens. I was into the idea of the future and traveling through time. I was into the idea of the great adventure into the unknown. And I was enthralled by it from very early on. And like a lot of us growing up, I went to see all the science fiction movies and for my period, it was the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I went to see the first Star Wars 11 times when it came out. I'm sure there's people who have been worse than that. And as I got older, I kept reading science fiction, which I got into pretty young too. And I started to write about it. And as I started to teach courses on the future, I included science fiction as a big part of the courses that I would teach on the future and the stuff I would write on the future. And futurists, in fact, noted early on in my writings that I was giving science fiction a lot more attention than most futurists, in fact, give it. Because I came to the conclusion by the time I was teaching it that science fiction is unequivocally the most influential modern form of thinking about the future in our contemporary world. People are influenced by science fiction a lot more than any other way of thinking about the future, about presenting it, because science fiction comes in cinematic form, comes in movie form, comes in comics form, comes through conventions, it comes through virtual reality games. One historian of science fiction said, the world is looking more and more like science fiction, and science fiction is looking more and more like the world. So we are sort of living in a world that is both saturated with a lot of science fiction. Most of the biggest money-making movies of all time are science fiction movies.
True.
And science fiction through the decades, the centuries, has had a big impact on human imagination and human thinking, on not just science and technology. Science fiction is about the future of everything. So science fiction has had an impact on all aspects of human life. So I eventually got to the point where I decided that instead of just doing courses and writing articles, I wanted to write a history of science fiction, which is what I'm immersed in the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, even though I have always been a lover of science fiction, I've actually immersed myself in science fiction more in the last 3 or 4 years than any period of my life. I've read more science fiction books in this last 3 or 4 years than any other period.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm reading like, 50, not 50, maybe 50 to 100 new science fiction novels a year, somewhere in that range over the last 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
And reading a lot of early stuff too that I never read before. So, the last 3 or 4 years, science fiction has really been in the center of my consciousness. So that's just a little bit about my relationship with it. It's a relationship of love. It's something that has always gotten to me at a very deep level, and science fiction just expands your consciousness. It expands it way out there.
So when you're talking about the history, are you talking about just the written history, or are you talking about, because you could even consider science fiction as like, when they were talking about when they were coming up with the Greek gods, because in a way that's, science fiction, and the fact that, there was Zeus and all this other stuff that, had all these different, are you covering all the way back to that period?
Yeah, let me add to that too, real quick, Tom, because I think this would really help our guests kind of surmise this, right? I'm actually envisioning the same thing. Because I think some of our guests will think of science fiction. They'll think of Star Wars. They'll think of, Minority Report. They'll thought, we just had Strange Days. There was that 90s movie that came out. It was about virtual reality. But even when we put on our Futurist hat, which is sort of supposed to be a little bit wider, I think science fiction is stories that want to interpret what the future may hold. So obviously you're not going to have gesture computing or virtual reality 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or even 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But you did have people surmising what the future may be like or what it's about. So interested to know, in your sort of historical digging, what you found out and about what science fiction truly is and how these stories help to shape our lives around it.
Yeah. Okay. What science fiction is science fiction is our contemporary mythology of the future. Contemporary. And it's contemporary because it's informed by a modern scientific view of reality to a degree, not entirely so. So you'll find mystical stuff in a lot of even contemporary science fiction, like in The Matrix and Star Wars. You have the Force and you have mind over matter and all that kind of stuff, and spirits. But it's mythic. And by mythic, I mean that it's fantastical stories about ultimate reality that provide a sense of meaning and purpose and explanation for people. And it has its roots in ancient myths, which were not informed by a scientific view of reality, but were informed more personified, deified, ancient theories of reality. And little by little, over the centuries, what we call modern science fiction began to incorporate more of a modern perspective on reality, and not entirely, but the history of it, the history of great myths about the future, about fantastical beings, that goes back thousands. And so my history of science fiction starts with ancient Greek mythology and Middle Eastern mythology. And I always have as a question I throw out at people, when do you think the first science fiction story was written? And the answer I'll give them, because a lot of times they may say Frankenstein, which is 19th century, I'll say the first science fiction story was a story called True History by a Roman writer named Lucian in 150 AD. And it was a story about journeying to the moon, where people on a sailing ship encountered beings who lived on the moon and encountered beings who lived on the sun, and had an interplanetary war over who was going to settle Venus. Now, this was written in 150 AD, and there was a telescope in it too. So the first robot, although we think of robots as something that is a more recent imaginative creation, the first robot was actually could be found in ancient Greek mythology, Talos, who was created by the Greek god Hephaestus, and that story goes back 600 BC. So ideas have been around for a long, long time that have inputted into science fiction and its development. So in my first book, I start with Prometheus and the Greek myths and the Jason and the Argonauts and other ancient stories. There were fantastical adventures with fantastical beings who had incredible powers. And in fact, you brought up the Greek gods. Our comic book characters today, our Marvel and DC superheroes, are our modern version of the Greek gods of the past, with superpowers that in our contemporary time are often technologically facilitated, in part at least, but they have all these fantastical powers and they fight against evil forces and they orchestrate the doings of reality and of humanity. And they have the same kind of role and same kind of characteristics as the ancient Greek. And I don't want to just include the Greeks because, of course, in the Middle East and India and China and other parts of the world, there were also super powerful beings imagined there too, that were analogous to our modern day comic book superheroes as well. And sometimes it's hard to even tell what's an ancient vision like Thor. Is Thor something that's from Norse mythology? But the modern Thor, he has various technological and contemporary refinements to him, and he mixes it up with all the rest of his buddies like Iron Man, and so it's very, very difficult to sort of separate out, which of these creatures, which of these beings is an ancient god, and which of these is a modern Marvel or DC hero. You instill.
Tom, tell me, so I'm going to stop you there because I wanted to talk to you about the evolution of humanity. That's part of the reason we asked you on here to talk about that. And piggybacking off the idea of Thor as technology, incorporating that and changing humanity. Tell us about what you write about that in your book.
Yeah, the evolution of humanity as envisioned through science fiction and the evolution of humanity into the future has different aspects to it, different pieces to it. We can imagine that, and lots of science fiction writers have imagined this, that through the process of natural selection over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, humanity would change as a consequence of Darwinian evolution. And that you see in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. You have the Eloi and the Morlock, and they have evolved from where we are today, 800,000 years into the future. On the other hand, you could imagine, and science fiction writers have done this too, we can, with bioengineering, genetic engineering, intentional biological manipulation, alter, change the human form. We can make aquatic, aerial, different types of humans through biological science, purposefully using biological science and biological technology to guide the future evolution of humans. A third way you can go is you can have various technological enhancements embedded into a human, turning them into a more and more elaborate type of cyborg. Another way you could go would be that you are able to decode or code the entire mental consciousness of a human and then download it into a robot. And now we have a robotic human. And then another way you could go, and these are all in science fiction, is that you don't download the human mind into a specific robot. You download the human mind into a virtual reality universe where that mind can adopt whatever particular virtual form it wants to, or it can manifest itself using nanotechnology into whatever particular physical form it wants to be at that point in time. The last couple examples there are all covered, interestingly, in Greg Egan's book about future human evolution called Diaspora, where we have three different versions of future humans: robotic, virtual, and unenhanced. So future human, and excuse me, I left out one other possibility. Another significant possibility is that through the intentional development of the mind, where the human and post-human mind attempts to discipline and enhance its own abilities through meditation, mental exercise, philosophical higher systems of thinking, we evolve our minds consciously way beyond where they are right now. And in fact, you can combine all those different ways together. In Olaf Stapleton's novel in the 1930s, The Last and First Men, he has 18 different visions of future human species.
Wow.
Yes, that run out 2 billion years into the future. He has big brain humans. He has philosophically enhanced humans. He has collective consciousness humans. He has humans who can travel through time with their minds. So there's lots of different ways the future evolution of humanity could go that are covered in science fiction. And I'm sure I'm leaving some basic ones out.
I mean, this is it's really quite amazing what you've been probably able to uncover really in these past couple of years that you've been diving into, science fiction. You've already talked about its journey really for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years and going into just maybe even 100 years ago. We're talking about these crazy scientific fiction visions that really are even beyond some of what normal America probably can comprehend when they go to the movieplex or even pick up a book. One thing I'm interested though, because one thing I do whenever I collect a bunch of data is I try to sort it, right? Okay, sort it as best as possible. And I was reading a futures studies paper, of course, right? Because that's what we're in. And they were talking about how science fiction or future-oriented science fiction can be categorized into 4 distinct kind of categories. One, sort of cautionary tales, emphasizing the consequences of things in society. Thought experiments like what if stories,
right.
Metaphoric sort of stories. What if space aliens did X, Y, Z? And then just general explorations of new science, technology, or even sort of societal things. I'm sure now that you have scraped all this data up, you may have an idea around that particular the categorization. Did you find any categorizations along your way when you were putting all these together, trying to figure out, where parts of this science fiction sort of, lineage, where it all falls? And maybe just explain maybe some of the differences on why maybe some science fiction you think might have more impact, or maybe some critical impact, or even public impact, versus maybe some science fiction, that one that you're actually just talking about, that actually isn't getting the maybe public emphasis, but maybe it would give more future-oriented folks, some thoughts to ponder.
Yeah. Let's see. There's lots of different category systems that people have come up with for science fiction. If you go look at the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, they have a category system. The 4 that you listed, to me, seem very limited. Like one that hits me right off the top of my head is alternate realities, alternate histories, alternate parallel universes. And that's been an element, a theme through science fiction. You did cover cautionary tales. The reverse is going to be optimistic tales. And then the real mind blower is where you read it and you don't know whether this, in fact, is a cautionary tale or an optimistic tale. Because it may be that the future would be so strange that from our point of view, it would look horrendous or terrible, but in fact, it may not be, if you stretch your mind far enough. There's, of course, you could categorize science fiction into stories about space travel, alien encounters, alien civilizations, robots, AI, journeys to strange or bizarre lands. Mental evolution, social evolution. Even there's science fiction stories that deal with contacting God or gods or deities. And there's science fiction stories that go into the future. There's science fiction stories that go into the past. There's science fiction stories that go around in circles in both directions. And so when you brought up the four and then asked me to try to categorize science fiction, I do have lots of categories, but I don't know whether or not, like in my course, I have 25 different categories.
Oh, wow.
Quite a few. All right. There's lots of main themes. What other ones what I would think of here? I'll tell you one, though, that is an important one. Everybody's familiar with the story of Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. And the story of Frankenstein, at one level, from the perspective of the writer, Mary Shelley, was a warning that one should not attempt to play God and manipulate reality or try to gain control of reality through the use of science, that maybe we're not wise enough to have such incredible powers. And Frankenstein is, of course, a warning tale. That theme gets repeated over and over and over again, especially in science fiction cinema, where we have some effort to become very powerful and control things through technology, and then it backfires on us. And it's a very scary kind of vision, in the sense that we don't really trust ourselves, and we think that if we use technology to try to become more godlike, it's going to backfire on us. That's what happens metaphorically, not to us, but to the Krell in the movie Forbidden Planet. They gain the power of mind over matter, and they all kill each other, and that they gain that power. So there's this warning that comes up. The warning that is, don't get too arrogant. Don't feel like you could control the universe like God, because you can't. And if you push yourself too far in the direction of using technology and science, it's going to bite you back. And I think that's a rather negative and pessimistic vision, but it's a vision that keeps coming up. It keeps coming up ever since Frankenstein. That's a major theme. The more important major theme would be that the universe is more, the universe of possibilities, wondrous and bedazzling than we could possibly imagine. And even if the future is scary, and even if we're going to encounter things that are going to unsettle us mentally, it actually, in the final analysis, is a growth-promoting, great experience that we are in the process of engaging in. That one should have overall more of an optimistic and less of a pessimistic attitude about the strange possibilities ahead of us. Although humans do get scared about the strange possibilities ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and so, Tom, then tell me, this is a strategic foresight. We talk about the future a lot on this podcast. Tell me, what, in your view, what does science fiction tell us about the future of humanity? Like, what technologies do you see becoming reality? Obviously you don't share that pessimistic point of view. I mean, tell us Tom Lombardo's point of view.
Yeah, I think that the future is going to be increasingly more complex than the past. And so when people today say, I wish for the good old days when things were simpler, okay.
Yeah.
What we will encounter as we move forward is the people 100, 200 years from now will be saying that our era was simple and they would like to go back to that more idyllic and peaceful past. I think that really good science fiction about the future, like the novels The Diamond Age, Hyperion, river of gods, create extremely rich and complex visions of the future, socially, psychologically, technologically, ecologically. That is, we can't just imagine, like in Star Trek, that we have really super duper spaceships and that humans don't change, because the humans are going to change too. And the morality is going to change, the ethics is going to change. So I'd say what really good science fiction tells us is the future is going to get even more complex and rich along every possible dimension that you could imagine, including culture too, and art. Like science fiction writers have imagined all of the different using technology, but also with our changing way of thinking about ourselves, how we can transform ourselves into artistic objects in different kinds of ways that we never imagined before. And what I would say is go look for science fiction that writes about the entire complex reality of humans in all the different dimensions and imagines them as richer, more complex, and colorful than even today. And there are writers who do that. Science fiction is supposed to get you to think. Science fiction isn't dumb literature. Science fiction, when it's done well, is intelligent literature, like going all the way back to H.G. Wells. So the good science fiction writer is going to be producing this rich and mind-stretching and complex and surprising vision of the future or of some alternate reality, and you're going to get many different versions of them too. Mm-hmm. You won't even just one. It's not like they're going to say, oh, this is the way it's going to go. It could go this way, it could go this way, it could go this way, it could go that way. But don't just get locked in on the technological stuff, and don't get locked in on, let's say, I wish things would get simpler. No, they're not going to get simpler. They're going to get even more involved and rich and complex. And humans are going to diversify, I imagine. I see that coming. We're going to diversify even more so than we are right now. And maybe societies will diversify too, even more so. I don't think we're going to go homogenous. And I don't think we have to worry about some big, uniform, global government where everybody wears the same color clothing and everybody is controlled by one unified force. In fact, we're getting more and more fractionated over time and more diversity. So I know that's sort of general, my answer, like what does science fiction envision? Science fiction envisions a million different things happening and by 1,000 different writers. And the best way to get a sense of it is to dive into a lot of them and see what these rich pictures are like. Like the three that I mentioned, Hyperion, River of Gods, and the Diamond Age are three really good, rich, complex visions of future human society 100, 200, 500 years out.
That's fantastic, and I think this is really good because what you're talking about is sort of painting deep, rich stories, like you said, that are sort of thinky, right? Make people really think on things. And I think what really makes people think is actually them stepping inside worlds. This is one thing we've talked about on the podcast, design futures. Some people call it sense making, where we're giving people meaning behind the experiences around them. That's what plays, that's what these stories were around the campfire. And of course, that's what movies and virtual reality is going to go to. I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about what science fiction has done to get people to imagine futures and also to create futures as well. One thing you hear about all the great innovators of society, most of them are, not only maybe futurist in their minds, but they're sci-fi buffs, right? They either were connected to technology or they were connected to the future visions of what the world may be, either through these books or through a radio cast or through, their father being an engineer and showing them the future of XYZ, whatever. So we're littered with all these really capable entrepreneurs who are building the future. And it just so happened that they were given these ideas because they happened to see these visions through this sense making in this science fiction world that you're talking about. And what I find really kind of interesting about this is that, we're talking about gesture computing. We're talking about, one of our first Paleo futures we talked about. It was this 100-year-old book or 100-year-old short story about an intercommunication piece, and this person living in this pod. This was like 100 and something years ago, and I'm like, how did they even imagine that?
The machine stops.
Yes, machine stops. That was on our second episode.
Yes, 1906. That was written. Yep. And it was a very prescient story that anticipated an internet world, a private cubicle enclosed kind of reality where everybody depended on this global machine that would deliver information and all of the necessities of life to your little enclosed reality, and you never had to go out of it and connect or make contact with any other human, and then the machine broke. It was very good, yes. It's in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, in fact, that story, The Machine Stops. Yeah, so the beginning of... Yeah,
so, Tom, I was gonna ask you, so what do you think about, then, this sense-making / world and how it's driving possible future endeavors?
Right.
And maybe one's feeding the other, and they're both feeding each other at the same time.
Yes, okay, all right. Like, for example, Robert Goddard, who created the first workable rockets that went up into space, he was inspired in that endeavor because when he was young, he read H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds and the Martians coming to the Earth in their particular kind of interspatial vehicles. And Goddard said it was reading The War of the Worlds that got him into space travel and got him into developing rockets. So the beginning of rockets actually comes off of Wells' The War of the Worlds is one example. A negative kind of example to bring up is that beginning in the 1870s, there was a whole slew, like 500 maybe, of future war novels that were written around in Europe that got people so apprehensive and so paranoid and so militarily prepared to go to war with each other that by 1915 they did. Okay, that is, in this case here, we made a prediction which became a self-fulfilling prophecy because we influenced people to become so paranoid and fearful and militarily minded that the prediction we made actually came to fulfillment, even though it was a negative prediction that you're going to go to war with each other. And so future war novels were very popular in Europe between 1870 and 1915, and World War I broke out. Now, some people might say that those novels didn't cause the war to break out, but they sure as hell primed the pump. And it goes without saying, I think, that probably people who are in any areas of science or technology as adults were readers of at least some science fiction and inspired by some science fiction as a child. And the thing science fiction does, and you brought it up, Chris, is it creates a immersive experience. It's not like reading an abstract textbook. You actually live and feel it through a story. And that really stimulates people's juices, a lot more so than just simply reading a textbook. So you become inspired. It hits you at an emotional level, and kids get hit at an emotional level, and they grow up and they become they're inspired by the science fiction they read when they're young. They're inspired by science, and they become scientists and engineers. I would guarantee you that the majority of adult scientists and technologists and engineers have read and been influenced by science fiction as children.
Well, so Tom, then tell me, what do you think are, one, the most influential science fiction books for yourself? And then two, what are some of the most influential overall? And they could be the same thing.
Yes, right. Okay. Obviously, The Time Machine and War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, but also The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, too. The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells as well. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, and From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Last and First Men and Star Maker by Olaf Stapleton. Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Brave New World, which is a real shocker if you go back and read that novel, which was written in 1932. That was a very powerful and shocking and influential novel about the automation of human life and the turning modern society into a world of momentary, thoughtless pleasure. A very prescient novel. But so was 1984. Very influential and scary novel, too. Let's see. Isaac Asimov's novels about robots had a big influence on people's thinking on robots. And let's see. What other influence? And Neuromancer by Gibson. Okay. That was a very influential, anticipating cyberpunk, anticipating cyberspace, and helping to create it, too, at the same time. And let's see, Dune. Dune was very influential. It's and Stranger in a Strange Land from about the same time, because those were kind of hippie science fiction novels, and they influenced the free love, drug culture, new wave kind of thinking in science fiction and in culture too. When women writers got into science fiction, that had an impact as well, like Ursula Le Guin, the Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. There were some very important, novels written by women science fiction writers back in the 60s into the 70s, and then of course up to present time. And
what about films?
Yeah, all right, and I can go on. Like Charles Stross' Accelerando, which was written about 10 years ago. That is, I think, a very significant and important science fiction novel. Oh, and Perdido Street Station by China Miéville. That is an incredible work of imagination and very influential. And I always tell people that if you've never read that, you got to go read it. And most recently, I should also mention, in the last 5 years, Xin Lu's Three Body Problem trilogy. And he is one of the most influential writers of science fiction in China. And his Three Body Problem trilogy was translated into English over the last 3 or 4 years. And one volume won the Hugo, one volume won the Locust, and the really great, significant new stuff, like in this last 5 or 10 years, written by somebody from China. So that's at least some, what I would consider. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury is another one.
So
Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Yes.
Well, and Tom, did you look at film and media when you were doing this as well? Did you see films like Star Trek and Star Wars and television shows like Star Trek? Obviously, those are hugely influential in modern day.
Yeah. I've been. Let's see. Volume 1 goes up to the Volume 1 only goes up to the beginning of the 20th century, so there's no cinema media in the first volume. But Volume 2, what I'm working on now, goes up to the 1940. So, like for example, I think one of the all-time great science fiction movies is Metropolis by Fritz Lang, which was done in the 1920s. Now I've watched that like 10 times maybe. So, yes, I've always been into science fiction movies, and as the volumes come out, cinema will become a bigger and bigger chunk. Beginning with the first science fiction movie was Méliès's A Trip to the Moon in
I saw that.
Yeah, in 1905. You could watch the whole thing on YouTube, and cool. And they drew in or colored in the individual frames on that. That was the first science fiction movie. And But as soon as the movies started, science fiction started to appear in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
Through the 1920s, and then one of the early, there was a very famous communist science fiction movie called Elita, which has some interesting stuff in there about the Martians and the planet Mars. And that was done back in the 20s too. And they just keep producing them, of course, decade by decade. Yeah. Well, so I'm definitely watching it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that's awesome, Tom. I think we could go into this topic so much that I think that we're going to have you back on the show. That's just that simple.
Yes. Like for example, Jack, I watched the entire it's not that new anymore, Battlestar Galactica series.
Oh yeah.
It's great. Twice through.
Great. Yeah.
And now I'm watching the entire Stargate Atlantis series, which is 5 seasons through.
Yeah.
There's a lot of TV science fiction as well, obviously.
Yeah, so we could talk about a lot of that. And I think we're going to have you back on the show just to talk about the media. Well, maybe when Volume 2 gets released.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Yes.
So, Tom, and this is the point in the show where we really we ask our guests to plug their materials. In your book that just came out, tell everybody where they can get it. Any other ways of any conversations you're holding? Are you going on a book tour? Tell us more about that.
Well, okay. Here's volume 1 of a projected 4-volume series titled "Science Fiction: The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future," and this is volume 1. Prometheus to the Martians. So it goes back to ancient times and goes up to the end of the 19th century when people became very fascinated with Mars and all different images of Martians, culminating in H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. This will be available on Amazon sometime in the next month. The latest release date is December the 14th, but it's up there right now. And it could be released by December the 1st and November the 30th or something. And there'll be 3 more volumes of this. And the next volume is The Time Machine to Star Maker, and that should be coming out the following year, because that's what I'm working on right now. And that'll go from 1900 to 1940. And then there'll be 2 more volumes. But this is a great book, even if I wrote it myself. I really think it's good. I will sit sometimes and I will look at it. In fact, just to put in a plug, this is the one I published the year before, Future Consciousness. This is already out, and this is a really great book too. And so
it is.
I did 2 really chunky books in the last 2 years here. But if you want to get a rich historical interdisciplinary perspective on the really deep importance of science fiction, this is something to read. I got the philosophy, the myth, social development, technological. The first cyborg is 1870.
Very cool.
Yes, lots of stuff in there. So that's out in the next couple of weeks or the next month at the most.
Well, definitely, if you're a science fiction fan, you have to read Tom's stuff. Thank you again, Tom, so much for being on our show. We definitely want to have you back, and we appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.